He's not only a preacher, but a teacher of preachers and an historian who's written extensively about the Civil War. He brings to this issue some unique insights. He's Dr. Judd Lake. I'm John Bradshaw, and this is our conversation. Dr. Judd Lake, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here, John.
A special pleasure to have you here. Listen, we're going to talk about the Civil War from, I think, a really unique perspective that is frequently or is infrequently discussed. We'll look at it from a spiritual perspective and what the war and the flow of the Civil War meant, looking at it from maybe a biblical view. But before we get to that, who's Judd Lake? Where are you from?
Judd Lake. I'm from Alabama.
Which part of Alabama?
Born Huntsville, Alabama.
Oh, look at that.
Northern Alabama.
Not terribly far from where we are. That's here
right.
On the outskirts of Chattanooga, Tennessee. When you were a little boy, you were one day going to grow up to be what?
Wow, a football player.
Oh, yeah?
Which is funny considering my size.
Okay, but every boy's going to grow up to be a football player.
That's right.
Or a fireman or an astronaut or something like that. You ended up becoming a minister of the gospel and then a teacher of ministers. So somewhere between the boy wearing the oversized helmet, between there and standing in a pulpit, preaching from a Bible, between those two places, a change in your worldview occurred. What brought that about?
Yes. Well, it was when I was 17 years old, and I was searching for God. I was very interested in things like the end of time. I was attending the United Methodist Church at the time. I grew up in the United Methodist Church. Good people. And I was interested in end-time events. Methodism, United Methodism, was not so much into that. And so I was studying with Baptists about the rapture and second coming, things like that. And I heard about an evangelistic meeting that was dealing with end-time events. And I went to it, and it was more than just end-time events. It was about becoming a Christian, about knowing God better, as well as studying Daniel and Revelation. And I attended those meetings, and I learned Bible truths I'd never heard before. And most importantly, the visuals that the evangelists used, they were pictures of Jesus in His second coming. Growing up a Methodist, I really didn't hear much about the second coming of Christ. And to see those pictures of Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven moved my soul. And through that experience, I came to know Jesus. And that was my conversion experience.
Where were your parents during this time? Were they walking with you on this journey, or were they wondering what was going wrong with their boy?
It was a journey on my own.
Really?
And I was able to drive, and I would drive downtown to see these meetings.
And so you made a big turn in your faith experience. What did your parents think? Did you have their approval?
They thought it was good because it was a very positive turn in my life.
Oh, that's good.
Compared to things I was doing before, getting into trouble and things like that.
So were you a troubled kid or a kid who occasionally found trouble?
Maybe a combination of both.
Okay.
I wouldn't say I was a kid that did a lot of really bad things. I did little things. I got into some vandalism one time, did the typical smoking marijuana, things like that, but not any serious drug issues or serious crime issues, nothing like that.
So go back to 14, 15-year-old you and meet your friends, the kids you used to monkey around with. Tell them then that 20 years later you're going to be a preacher of the gospel, and they would have said,
no way.
Oh, really? Yeah?
In fact, one of my friends from that era, years later, when I was studying at a Christian university to become a pastor, Southern Adventist University, where I teach now.
Oh, yeah?
He came to visit me, and we hadn't seen each other in all these years, and he just was blown away that I was studying to be a preacher. Because back then I was a crazy kid, and we were into UFOs and space and science fiction and all those type of things, and the thought that I would become a preacher back then was just not in my mind, and certainly not in my buddies'
When
minds.
you were 17, going through this metamorphosis, were you aware, as you were learning and growing in your faith and learning new things, were you aware my life is really about to change? Did you have that sense?
Yeah. Yeah, as I was listening to the meetings, learning these new Bible truths, encountering Christ in a way I never had before, it felt like something epic was happening in my
Yeah.
life. And that, in fact, is what happened. It changed the entire course of my life.
Pretty quickly?
I joined another church,
Yeah.
the Adventist church,
Yeah.
and I went off to an Adventist school.
Oh, you did?
My parents allowed me to go to a boarding school. And it was...
What were
that
they
was the-
thinking?
They figured that for the first time in my life, I had focus, I had a meaning and a purpose. That is something they hadn't seen before.
Yeah. So when you eventually went off to an Adventist university, you started studying for the ministry, did they think, oh, this is getting away from us, or did they say, good boy, he's
They
doing
thought
something
this was
honorable?
great.
They really did.
My mother, to this day, is a very devout Methodist, Bible-believing, Jesus-loving Christian.
And proud of you?
Absolutely.
That's
Her
wonderful.
prayers through the years, I believe, have made a profound difference in my life.
Oh, how outstanding is that? Well, that's great.
And while we may be different denominations, she's a Methodist, I'm an Adventist, our hearts are one in
Yeah,
Christ.
sure, and
that's just been the greatest blessing in my life.
And why should it not be that way? Absolutely. Okay, so you went off to an Adventist high school, and then you decided you're going to go to college. From the outset, going to college, were you going to study for the ministry?
Absolutely.
Oh, you were?
As soon as I got to the boarding academy and developed a group of friends that are my life friends to this day.
And this was a school called Bass Memorial
Bass
Academy.
Memorial
correct?
Academy.
Yeah.
That is correct. And it was the connection with fellow believers, making new friendships, forging new lifelong friends that is what changed my life. And in just the experience there, I'd never been to a school that was Christian like that. I'd gone to public high schools all my life. And that's where I felt that tug in my heart. I want to serve God full time.
Okay.
I want to be a preacher. And so I had preaching opportunities at Bass Academy.
Oh, fantastic. So before we're done, we want to talk about preaching. You're an author. Among other things, you've written about the Civil War. I want to talk with you about that soon. There's really a lot to cover. But first, your life has changed. You are at a church university. You're studying for the ministry. They cut you loose. You became a pastor. Whereabouts? Back in the South?
That's right. I went to the Gulf States Conference of Seventh-day Adventist,
Yeah.
Alabama, Mississippi area.
Yeah.
Pastored there for about 10 years.
Yeah. How did you enjoy pastoral ministry?
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
It was great.
Biggest challenges? Two of the biggest challenges. What were they?
Dealing with cranky people.
and I bet if I asked you the greatest joy, you'd say dealing with wonderful people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, most of them were wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, every pastor, you're going to be challenged by people and relationships, but in general, the Adventist people are good people.
No doubt.
And it was a wonderful blessing. But that was a challenge. And then basically time management.
Why?
Because you pastor, it's full time, 24/7.
Yeah.
And you've got to manage your home life, your personal life, your own devotional life. You've got to attend to your flock, and it's not like a 8 to 5 job. It's full time.
How many churches did you have when you first came out of college?
I had 2.
Okay. And
Two
did you
churches.
ever have more than 2?
No, I'm sorry. When I started with 3.
Yeah, there
no,
you
that's
go.
right. I started with 3. I ended up with 2
Yeah.
in Gulf States.
Yeah. I wonder, and I don't mean the poor us thing. I don't mean that. But I wonder if many people, or what percentage of a congregation really recognizes the challenges that a pastor faces in keeping all those plates spinning. You've got to be a psychologist, to some degree a counselor. You've got to be a preacher. You've got to be, you're running a small business, you know.
You're a CEO.
You're a CEO.
In many ways.
You got to be all of these things. It's not for the faint
And generally,
of
you
heart.
have a family on top of that.
There you go. Yeah. So it's not for the faint of heart.
Well, that's why in my first set of doctoral studies, I studied time management.
Oh yeah. Okay. So is there such a thing as time management?
There is, believe it or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet you those studies helped immensely.
They did.
Yeah, fantastic.
They did indeed.
So
I teach that subject to this day.
Oh, you do?
I teach a graduate class for pastors in time management.
Oh, fantastic. And desperately needed class. So you transitioned from the pulpit to the classroom. Was that always going to happen in the back of your mind, or did this opportunity come to you as a bit of a surprise?
That evolved in my early years of ministry. My area of great interest was studying and preaching, and I loved all the other work, but I was gravitated towards study and preaching. I would visit my church members and go to there was a theological library where one of the churches I
Nice.
pastored, and I would get my visiting done with, and I'd end up the day in the library researching and studying.
Nice.
That was a great love. And,
Oh, yeah.
and so I knew over time I wanted to go back and do doctoral studies and teach.
Did you teach? Were you able to teach first and then get a doctorate? Or did you complete your doctoral studies and then teach?
I completed a doctor of ministry
Yeah.
while I was pastoring.
Ooh.
And then from
Time
there,
management. Time management.
yeah, and the doctor of ministry dissertation was on time management.
Ooh, wow.
So that helped.
Yeah, sure.
And then from there, I went to Broadview Academy at the time, and I taught because that was my door into teaching. And so I was the pastor, chaplain, and Bible teacher.
That was in Illinois.
Boy,
correct?
time management really helped in that. That's right,
Right.
Illinois Conference. I was there 2 years, and that paved the way for coming to Southern.
Yeah.
Because once they learned that I was teaching Bible, well, they needed somebody to teach teachers how to teach Bible as well as teach ministry and other subjects, and so that opened the door, and Jack Blanco called me to Southern.
Fantastic. I'd love to talk about that, but I don't want time to get away from us without digging into this area of expertise of yours, which is the Civil War. Was that always an interest for you, the Civil War?
No.
Well, how did you stumble
Oh, well, I
upon
mean,
that?
general interest.
Yeah,
you know,
but
not an area of specialty. And it took me a while, not having any expertise or even ever taken a class in the Civil War. It took me a while to just to reading book after book until I began to get a feel for all the different battles and the different theaters of the war and how it progressed and everything. And as I got into it, I fell head over heels in love with it.
it's interesting to me that you look at the Civil War through the lens of various or varying historians, and they'll paint a different picture.
Mm-hmm.
They'll say, here, this was the key issue, that was the key issue. Depends who you read. Slavery was the issue. Others will say, well, wasn't really slavery, it was states' rights. Others will say, well, it was states' rights because of slavery. And historians will spin this in various ways, and I guess they have to earn a living somehow. Talk about the Civil War big picture. How'd we end up in that mess, and what drove
excellent.
that?
And you just touched on the hot issue. You know, as I studied it, I got into every aspect of it. And it took me 4 years to write the book, research and write the book, as long as it took to fight the war.
Wow, yeah, look at
I
that.
didn't anticipate. I didn't plan it that way. It just happened. But you hit the nail on the head about the difference of opinions with historians and the nature of slavery and the war. But you go back into America's history, you know, slavery goes back to our very beginnings. And the southern states took a different trajectory than the North did.
Yeah.
The North began to focus more on its economy and capitalism, and the South, its identity and its economy was the slaves. And that went into the 19th century, and it began to grow and escalate. And you have what historians call the antebellum years, and the peculiar institution
Yes.
that it was called of slavery. And slavery, the way it was practiced in the South, was different from the other countries in the world
That's
that
correct.
practiced slavery. And it took on a cruel, dark focus. But anyway, there's much we could say about that. But the politics was centered in slavery. And my view is I've researched the original documents, and mainline historians today acknowledge very clearly that slavery was clearly the foundation of the war.
Sure.
That's hard to miss. You look at the decade prior to the war in the 1850s, the major, we won't walk through it, but the major events, they were all related to slavery. You have long-term triggers, different compromises, the Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850, tightening up the fugitive slave law, a number of these things. The immediate trigger, and it was all connected with slavery, was really the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had argued that as the new states were developing in the West, I will not extend slavery there. We do not want to extend slavery in the West. Well, the South wanted to make those new states slave states. But Lincoln did say, look, no slave states in the West, but we'll leave slavery alone in the South. Lincoln, and I want to talk about the way he evolved throughout the war.
Because he did evolve.
That was, yes, indeed he did.
It's interesting when people try to pigeonhole Lincoln, they say he was this. Well, he may have been this in this moment, but what was he a year or 2 years later than that?
Oh, wow. You can see, and his religious life, his spiritual life, developed simultaneous with the war and the horrific tragedies on the battlefield that struck his heart, and tragedies in his own life, his marriage, the loss of his beloved son Willie in February of 1862. I mean, what the guy went through. But he was committed to saving the Union, preserving the Union, and by the Constitution. And the Southern states were rebelling in splitting up that Union in secession. But he was not committed to ending slavery. He said, and he made that clear in his first inaugural address in March 4 of 1861, I'll leave slavery alone in the South. But they didn't hear that. All they saw on the election of Lincoln was he's going to change our way of life and take slavery away from us. So that began the secession of the states.
Lincoln said, I'll leave slavery alone in the South. Was it okay for Lincoln to have said that? Now, we've got to be very careful with what lens we look back in time at. Got to take place and time into account. Lincoln, I don't believe, was playing a short game. He was playing a long game. If it was okay for Lincoln to make a statement like that, why was it okay?
Well, he was arguing from the perspective of the Constitution, because the Constitution had 3 slavery clauses embedded in it. And he believed it was his constitutional right to preserve the Union, but he didn't believe he had a constitutional right to change slavery in the South. So leave it alone. I mean, at the beginning of the war, it seemed almost impossible for slavery to be done away with. But Lincoln evolved through that process. And he came up with some brilliant strategies to change that, such as the Emancipation Proclamation. But let me get back to by the time the war began. What I think is fascinating is as you look at the beginning of the war and you trace it, and again, I'm looking at it from a religious perspective. That's what I did in my book with Ellen White. This is a religious interpretation of the war. And as I thought about it over the years, even since writing the book, I find it really interesting and helpful to view the war through the lens of the national fast that Lincoln called. He called 3 national fasts for prayer and humiliation. Fast days, I should say. Fast days of prayer and humiliation. Interestingly, Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy, he called for 8 days.
Oh, I didn't know that. Did he really?
Yeah, he called for 8 days and only 1 day of Thanksgiving. Lincoln called for just 3 days of fasting and prayer and 4 days of Thanksgiving. And you can understand with what would happen with the Confederacy, why they were desperately calling for these days of prayer and fasting, and the Lord evidently did not hear those prayers.
You know what? This is a good time for us to take a break. We'll come back to that battle in just a second, great. Because there's a lot there, and I know a lot you're going to lead us through. With Judd Lake, I'm John Bradshaw. This is Our Conversation. More in a moment, brought to you by It Is Written. There's something placed by God inside the human heart, a yearning to be free. And the actions of some went beyond the page and the lecture hall to the tracks of something that became known as the Underground Railroad.
Still away, still away, still away to Jesus, still away, still away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
Watch Midnight to Dawn on itiswritten.tv.
Welcome back to Conversations, brought to you by It Is Written. My guest is Dr. Judd Lake. He is an historian who's written extensively on the subject of the Civil War, not just an historian, but a preacher, a minister of the gospel, a teacher of preachers, and a teacher of ministers of the gospel. A moment ago, Dr. Lake, we had entered into, you started touching on the subject of the First Battle of Manassas. Why was that so significant? What happened there as we look at some of these spiritual underpinnings of the Civil War?
Mm-hmm. Well, at the time, it was the biggest battle they'd ever experienced. Like, it was far beyond what they'd experienced in the war with Mexico, the War of 1812. The loss of life was staggering to both the North and the South. It was an interesting battle because going into that battle, both sides believed it was going to be an easy battle. They were going to whip the enemy and the war would be over. And so they go at it, and the troops are green. The commanders had some experience in the war with Mexico, but they went at it, and it was a battle of intense attacks, counterattacks, retreats, and it ended, it went from about 10 in the morning up till 4 in the afternoon, and it's like all of a sudden it just came to an end with a massive retreat.
Was that expected?
No. And the newspapers all were saying, this is a mystery. How did this happen? And nobody really understood it. So it was basically a Confederate victory and a significant Union loss. And the North was just, how could this have happened? Nobody could understand it. In fact, the commanders in all the reports said, we chided them, we threatened the soldiers, we commanded them to get back in the field and finish the battle, and they didn't. But what's interesting, John, if they had continued retreating, because Manassas, you have Matthews Hill, it was fought on 3 rolling hills, then you have Henry Hill, and you have Chinn Ridge. As the flank of the Union, the Northern soldiers were charging. If they had broken through, what they didn't realize is back of Chinn Ridge, a large flank of Confederate brigades were coming around to flank them. And if they had gone in, they would have charged and hit them from behind and destroyed them.
Oh.
And it would have been a massive Confederate victory.
So is it fair to say...
Well, if you look at it from a religious perspective...
Depends whose side you're on.
Exactly.
Was this providential?
Yeah.
Okay, now, I want to ask you in a second about the abolitionist movement and what abolitionists had to do with this, and we'll get to the Emancipation Proclamation. My point a moment ago wasn't flippant. Depends what side you're on. So it was providential if you think God was on the side of the Union. It was certainly not providential if you think God was on your side and you're the side of the Confederacy. Talk to me about why this may have been providential.
Well, one thing about the Civil War is both sides believed earnestly God was on their side. They were religious armies. They were fighting for their identity. They were fighting for God. And so when they had the North, like, how could this have happened? And the South, the Confederates, they were really excited, and they started to pursue the retreating Federals. But a massive rain came, and they were not able to pursue them because they could have pursued them all the way, because they fled all the way back to Washington. Because, Manassas is not far from Washington.
That's
right. And the Confederates could have taken Washington.
Yeah, how much ground would they
have
have?
And that would have changed everything.
Everything.
Had that happened.
Yeah.
So if you come at it from the perspective of God was working on the North side, eventually to end slavery, then it was providential in the way this battle ended up, because it was humiliating for the North, but it was the South, they claimed it a great victory. But it helped, but it stopped things. It stopped any movement. The South was able to stop, the Northern troops from coming to Richmond, but they were not able to go to Washington. And so it allowed things to lay low for a while.
What, if anything, was heaven's aim, God's will, God's desire through the Civil War?
Well, you listen to the abolitionists. The abolitionists believed that slavery was a great stain of sin on this nation.
And it was.
It was indeed. And they believed that until the Union the North made the war a way to end slavery, God was not going to bless them.
Do you mean to indicate that the war was not necessarily, to begin with, designed to be a way to end slavery?
No, not at all. It was to save the Union. The North's sole purpose at the beginning of the war was to save the Union. Lincoln says that in his first inaugural in March 4. They had the inauguration in March 4 of those days.
And God looked on and said, no, that's not the point here.
Lincoln said clearly, I'm going to leave slavery alone in the South. We're just not going to extend it out in the West. But he said, I'll leave it alone. And that was his policy. And interestingly, you had, I think we all know the significance of the 13th Amendment at the end.
Sure.
But there was a 13th Amendment at the beginning.
At the beginning?
Yes.
What was that?
It was to, basically it was a compromise, a way to try to compromise with the South after the first wave of secession. It was on March 2, I believe, that this was brought, to the Congress and to the leaders, and it would have perpetuated slavery forever, because basically it was a amendment to the Constitution that Congress shall never change the slavery
Imagine
clauses. And it would have embedded slavery in this nation forever. It would have perpetuated it forever. It's interesting when you look at the two 13th Amendments.
Yeah.
The first one would have perpetuated it forever, and the second one abolished it forever.
Well, what happened to that first one? It didn't end up seeing the light of day.
It was not ratified because of the events that happened, with the war, and so it just kind of sat there, and then it was canceled out when the true 13th Amendment to end slavery was ratified.
Whose idea was that first 13th Amendment?
That was different pro-slavery leaders in Congress. That was the problem with America, with the North. And you look at the antebellum years, it was full of lots of compromises with the South.
Yes, that's true, isn't it?
And even in the Northern Army, you had a lot of generals who were pro-slavery sympathizers.
I have
pro-South sympathizers.
I have read, and you read, where there were some generals who were half-hearted in their efforts to press on to victory.
And one of the most frustrating to me as I read about him in battle was George McClellan.
Sure.
George McClellan was an excellent organizer. In fact, after the loss in Manassas, Lincoln had George McClellan, who'd won a couple of small battles, take the troops and shape them up, and he did just that.
Shaped them up.
But when it came time to fight, McClellan was a poor fighter, and Lincoln literally pulled his hair out. A lot of those gray lines on his face, part of that was from McClellan.
Okay, so listen, was McClellan a poor fighter only, or was he just not really committed to the cause?
I think it was a combination of both. You have different perspectives on that. Yeah. But there's times where you look where McClellan could have pursued a battle, and he would actually withdraw his troops. And he's not a good fighter because when he would go pursue Lee, sometimes on the Maryland campaign, to go after Lee, this is in 62, he hesitated. He actually, I'm jumping ahead here, but this is on the Maryland campaign in the summer of 62, he actually came across an incredible find. Somehow, a copy of Lee's orders for his army were wrapped. They had cigars were wrapped in it.
Oh.
And one of the generals evidently left it by a fire. And then when McClellan's troops came in, a low-ranking officer found this, and cigars, great, cigars, and open up. Whoa, what is this? And it was authenticated, passed up the lines to McClellan. He had the key to defeating Robert E. Lee's army.
Well, yes, what did he do?
Because Lee was going to split it, and McClellan he even said, these quotes saying, I now have a way to defeat Bobby Lee. And he sat on it for over a day.
Why?
Finally went up because he just hesitated. We don't know the details why, but that's where he was, had it been swapped, had Robert E. Lee found his orders, Lee would have launched his troops within an hour.
Yeah.
Within half an hour. But McClellan waited, and by the time he waited, it was too late. He'd lost the golden opportunity. And that set up the foundation, the groundwork for probably the most significant early turning point in the war, which is the Battle of Antietam. before I get to that, shall I back up and kind of walk to that, or how do you want to do that?
Please do.
Okay.
No, I wonder if you could go back a little bit and
Because I
walk
want to
us.
talk about those fasts in relationship to this.
Let's do that. Let's go back. You mentioned some fasts earlier in relation to this. This is very important. Perhaps you should walk us through the connection of, say, Manassas to Antietam, other battles of that nature, and make sure we deal with the abolition and
Yes.
its involvement in all of this.
Yes. This relates to the first fast. So after Manassas, it's a disaster. So Lincoln calls his first national day of prayer and fasting. It was September 26, 1861. And this is where the abolitionists come into play. Now, just a word about abolitionists. You had, prior to the war in the early decades of the 19th century, you had a form of abolitionism known as gradual abolitionists.
Sure.
They wanted to gradually do away with slavery.
And
But
you
then,
can understand that line of thinking.
yes, and in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, who would become the most famous abolitionist, white abolitionist, he launched his Liberator Journal, and he determined to end slavery now.
Sure.
That began immediatism,
And
immediate abolitionism.
And you can understand that line of thinking.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and that lasted up until the war. And those guys grew and escalated. The abolitionist story is an interesting one of twists and turns. And the Garrisonian abolitionists, as they're called, they fought with one another. They broke off. Then you had a group of political abolitionists, evangelical abolitionists, and even spiritualists were abolitionists. Spiritualists were some of the greatest patriots in the Civil War.
Have mercy, didn't
Yes,
expect to
indeed.
hear you
Very
say that.
that's they were. And then you had community abolitionists, different people. But anyway, they were all they were calling for the immediate end of slavery. You had some in the legislative halls of Washington as well. And so this went up to the Civil War. And in that time, Frederick Douglass, escaped slave, who became the most well-known black abolitionist in America before, during, and after the Civil War, he had Lincoln's ear through the war. And Lincoln listened to the abolitionist. He listened to Frederick Douglass. But when Lincoln called this fast now, back to the fast, in September 26, the abolitionists condemned it. Because slaves were escaping when the Union was advancing with its armies. Slaves were escaping to the lines. They were repulsed. They were sent back to slavery.
Oh.
And the Union's focus was saving the Union, not to end slavery. So the abolitionists condemned this fast. You read in different circles. All of them, they said, God is not in this, that the whole country was praying and fasting. God is not going to hear these prayers. Well, interestingly, he evidently didn't. Because that's where you get into, and I want my notes here because there's so much detail on this. I have a mind map of the war, and I use this when I talk about some of the details. But so McClellan, in the fall, McClellan built this big army, and then Lincoln said, go to Richmond next winter and take it. And McClellan, it was like slow as a snail. He finally got going. And so what happened in the spring and finally the summer, you have a series of these battles associated with Richmond. But I should add that the first big battle, which is much bigger, much greater loss of life than Manassas, was Shiloh, right in our neck of the woods here in western Tennessee.
Sure.
And Shiloh was a huge battle that shocked the country with a loss of life. That's where Ulysses Grant came into play and orchestrated that battle. It was a marginal win by the Union, but the loss of life was so great it wasn't like a victorious battle for the Union. But that was in the Western Theater, Tennessee and these Georgia and so forth. But the Eastern Theater, that was the Richmond area. Richmond had become the capital of the Confederacy. And so McClellan, that summer, surrounds it. And you have a series of these different battles. Thomas Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson, is in the Shenandoah Valley. That was the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And he launched a series of battles against Union troops that were just brilliant. And he became a terror to the Union. And that was a great loss. And then McClellan battled with Johnston, the general, in the Battle of Seven Pines. And that Johnston was wounded, and Jefferson put Robert E. Lee in his place, an unassuming general whom McClellan did not respect. But Robert E. Lee would go to become one of the great generals in history, as we know what would happen in the war. And in fact, he took over, and that's when McClellan launched his assaults on Richmond. And then after that, you have, in the summer of 61, you have the 7 Days Battle. It was 5 battles that were fought around Richmond. And McClellan could not advance beyond the lines, and Lee did a great job holding off McClellan from taking Richmond. And in the end, McClellan retreated, and Lee had saved Richmond, and that's where he was appointed the key general of the army, the Southern Army. But what happened, what is interesting about that, the 7 Days Battle, and this is where you see God's providence. Lincoln had been thinking about these things. He'd been thinking about his purpose in the war, and he realized he's got to do more than just save the Union. And that's where he was thinking about the idea of emancipating the slaves. And he came up with the Legal Emancipation Proclamation. And it was shortly after the 7 Days Battle was over, about latter part of July, that he started talking to his cabinet about the first draft. And he had written it probably early in that summer and shared it with them. And basically the consensus was, especially by the Secretary of State Seward, he said, wait till a battle victory. So Lincoln put the Emancipation Proclamation, the first edition of it, in his desk, and he waited, and it would be a long wait, because the next big battle was Second Manassas. And it looked like the Confederacy was going to win. The morale of the North was low. Lincoln was just in despair.
Now, you said something a minute ago that I've got to give you an opportunity to defend. You referred to Robert E. Lee as one of the great generals of history. Now, we remember that he was batting on the wrong team. It's not
in terms of military strategy. That's what I mean.
Oh, and I know that. I know you don't have a Robert E. Lee
I'm not a fan.
Poster on your bedroom wall, but
not a fan.
It can be said, and should be said by honest people, that Robert E. Lee was a great military strategist. Correct.
Definitely.
Yeah, and that's
wasn't
what you meant by
perfect,
that.
But overall he was very good.
Tremendously
Grant.
effective. Yeah, if the Confederacy had had more than 1 or 2 McClellans on their side, they might have lasted weeks, not years.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it, that these very brilliant people who fought for the Confederacy and ultimately succeeded in prolonging a bloody, ghastly, costly...
Lee was from Virginia.
Yeah.
So was Thomas Jackson. The best generals were in Virginia. So that's why when Virginia seceded in that second wave, the North knew, okay, this is going to be a fight.
Yeah, imagine if they hadn't. Things might have turned out very differently. Yeah. Okay, there's much more to cover. We were going to talk about preaching. I don't know if we'll get to that. We may have to talk about that another time, but let's see how it goes. I'm glad you're with us, and I'm glad he's with us. He is Dr. Judd Lake. I'm John Bradshaw. More of our conversation in just a moment. Brought to you by It Is Written. You know that at It Is Written, we are serious about studying the Word of God, and we encourage you to be serious as well. Well, here's what you do if you want to dig deeper into God's Word. Go to itiswritten.study for the It Is Written Bible Study Guides online. 25 in-depth Bible studies that will take you through the major teachings of the Bible. You'll be blessed, and it's something you'll want to tell others about as well. Itiswritten.study. Go further. Itiswritten.study. Welcome back to Conversations, brought to you by It Is Written. I'm glad that my guest today is Dr. Judd Lake. You've written extensively about the Civil War. Deep, fascinating, broad subject with historical implications, and that's to say the very least. So pick up where we were a moment ago, and be sure we're going to get to the Emancipation Proclamation and its impact on the Civil War.
It's coming next.
And we'll see the tide turn in a minute, and I'm going to ask you about the big picture, God in the Civil War. But proceed.
Yeah, we were at Second Manassas. Great loss for the Union. Lincoln's beside himself. A number of factors were happening. England was criticizing the North. They figured they were going to lose to the Confederacy and it would become an independent nation, and just did not look good. And then Lincoln's got the Emancipation tucked in his desk, and how's this ever going to happen? And then that set the stage, the maneuvers in the field for the Battle of Antietam. Antietam was fought in one day. John, that was the most significant battle of the Civil War
Antietam.
in terms of its turning point. I should say it's the first major turning point in the war. Antietam, in 11 hours that battle was fought in one day. It was the loss of life of epic proportion.
Ooh.
According to one estimate I read, every 6 to 7 seconds of the battle, a man was killed. Lines of soldiers would be mowed down. In fact, there were lines that consisted of men who were from a town, all the males of a town, and they were mowed down. And when the women got word, there was not a male in that town left. All their sons, their husbands were gone. There was nothing left but women to run the town. That happened a lot in the Civil War because these men would join together as militia, and they would join as towns, and so they would march together. And so at Antietam, they were just mowed down. The day after the battle, soldiers describe the battlefield as they walked it. It was a carnage of epic proportion. I won't even begin to describe how horrible it was in some of the testimonies. In other venues, I share about the testimonies of soldiers and what they saw. It was horrific. Still, though, Antietam was a marginal win.
Just a marginal win.
It was a marginal win for the Union. It was enough for Lincoln.
Right.
It was that win he was looking for.
Yeah.
And that's when he released the Emancipation Proclamation. He went to his cabinet. He told them, he says, look, I made a vow to God a while ago that when certain things happen, I was going to release this. I'm summarizing what he said.
Sure.
And now is the time. Lincoln felt God was moving him to do this. That's a lot of growth from a year prior to that.
Yeah, just a year
this
prior.
Man, the Lincoln, grew in his experience of the war, how to handle the war, and in his own spiritual life. And in the first, he released the initial draft. And then it was 100 days till January 1, 1863, when it would really kick in.
Yeah.
And on January 1, he signed it. And it was a little different. And he made a specific reference to the grace of God in it. So you can see this man is appealing to the Almighty. And in some of his papers that scholars have found, historians, this Lincoln was wrestling with this whole thing philosophically and theologically, and he believed he was an instrument in the hands of the Almighty. But this is evolving now.
Yeah.
So, all right. Then he calls for another fast on April 30 of 1863. There's been no action. And in the North are praying for victory. It's a different spirit now because the emancipation and the abolitionists were thrilled. It wasn't perfect, but in general they were delighted over the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was more like a war measure. It didn't free slaves immediately, only theoretically. But as the Union armies progressed into Southern territory and they met slaves, the slaves were freed. But on the day that fasting took place, the Battle of Chancellorsville, this is what I alluded to. I jumped ahead when I was talking about Thomas Jackson. That's the battle that he died. A great loss to Robert E. Lee, but it was also a significant loss to the Union. So it was a disaster. It's one of Lee's greatest battles strategically. That's where his brilliance in military strategy was really shown, is in the Battle of Chancellorsville. And it was a great victory, but a great loss for the Union. And they had just prayed. And it's like their prayers, the Emancipation Proclamation was released. Now the war was not only to save the Union, but to end slavery. What happened? Well, that summer, things began to change. You had the famous Battle of Gettysburg,
yes.
July 1 through 3. But interestingly, Gettysburg was a tactical victory because Meade, the commanding general of the Union, didn't destroy Lee's army. Lee actually escaped in a lengthy, brilliantly maneuvered retreat off the field. And Lincoln was so upset, beside himself at Meade, because he didn't go and destroy the principal Confederate army.
Why did he not?
Meade hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could do that. He had already a lot of loss, that Pickett's charge and at Gettysburg.
Well,
and also he just, for whatever reason, he just hesitated.
He and McClellan were cut from the same cloth.
They weren't sure that they could take Lee. He was afraid that Lee's army might turn on him in another angle.
Yeah, and it's not like they were fighting a weak
enemy. Exactly.
Yeah.
But Lincoln said, he was in your hand. Why didn't you take him? Anyway, a lot of details about that between Lee and Meade I won't get into. But the day after Gettysburg, the real strategic, see, Gettysburg was a tactical battle, not only immediate, because that's the focus of everybody is on the big battle of Gettysburg. It was big, but it was only a tactical victory. The strategic victory was Grant at Vicksburg. He had Vicksburg in siege, and on July 4, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, he broke through and took Vicksburg. Vicksburg owned the Mississippi. You take Vicksburg, you had the Mississippi.
Yeah.
The Mississippi was crucial to the Confederacy. So now, and then taking Vicksburg, he took a few other forts. Then the Union owned the Mississippi now. The Confederacy was cut in two. As Grant put it in his memoirs, this was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy.
It's interesting, too, to me, you've got a battle taking place in Gettysburg way up there, a battle taking place in Vicksburg way down there. Miles between. This Civil War was fought over a vast
Oh,
swath
yes,
of
yes, the
country.
different theaters. But let me jump now to the fall. You have the Battle of Chickamauga, which was a loss. Then the Battle of Chattanooga, our neck of the woods, right here, where your studio is, in the Chattanooga area. And the famous charge in Missionary Ridge, which we drive down the interstate, up that charge all the time. I love that, driving down the interstate. I always think about that charge. That first charge that ended in a victory, because the army on the ridge had the advantage, but the Union charged up and routed the Confederates. At any rate, it was a Union victory. So the battles of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga were the second major turning point in the war. That was the answer to that second day of fasting and prayer.
Yeah.
God was clearly involved, looking at it from a religious perspective. So that's the year 1863. Then that ends. The Union's on an upbeat note because, in fact, I should add that on that Thursday, November 24, the day after the Battle of Chattanooga, Lincoln called for a day of Thanksgiving. And on Thursday, and that is part of why we celebrate Thanksgiving on Thursday today. It was before that. George Washington established Thanksgiving on Thursdays, but Lincoln kind of ratified it, if you will. And we've continued that ever since. But a thankfulness for what God had done at the Battle of Chattanooga and Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Well, the next year, 64, Grant launched his overland campaign, which was composed of 4 major battles. Because of time, I won't get into those. And simultaneously, Sherman he left Chattanooga. Now, Chattanooga was so important because it was the gateway into the heart of the Confederacy, the gateway to Atlanta. So Sherman marches down to Atlanta, has a series of battles. Grant has these battles going on. It's vicious, bloody fighting. It ends up in the summer. Grant is stalled, holding Petersburg in siege. Sherman is holding Atlanta in siege. He's stalled at Atlanta. That summer, it's time for re-election. Guess who's going to run against Lincoln? George McClellan. It doesn't look good in the summer. Lincoln is thinking, there's no movement. Sherman is stalled before Atlanta. Grant is stalled before Petersburg. There's been bloody fighting. I'm going to lose this election. And McClellan hated the Emancipation Proclamation. He would have obliterated it had he become president. And so Lincoln calls for another day of fasting. It was on August 4. And the nation prays. And it's not looking good for Lincoln. Within a month, Sherman breaks through to Atlanta. That changed everything. Sorry, to me, it's just all the events and the way that they happened. Sherman wires Lincoln and says, we have Atlanta. Atlanta is ours. That is that's the third major turning point in the war. And then that brought on the election of Lincoln. Lincoln was elected. That was another turning point in the war, was Lincoln's election. And then that set the stage. Lincoln had all this political capital, and guess what he did with it? The Emancipation, or the 13th Amendment.
Yes.
To eradicate slavery from the Constitution. And that was actually done in, the movie Lincoln. Just watch that movie. It tells the story of the 13th Amendment. And in January, that's when they made that vote, and that changed history. And after that, all the battles were victories for the Union.
Why does this provoke such a strong depth of feeling in you?
Well, you know, as I told you before, I hadn't studied the war before. And when I really got into it, I was going through a challenging period in my life. And I was able to connect with the suffering of the nation, Lincoln's suffering, the loss of his son, the troubles he was having with his wife Mary. After that, her deep depression, all of the pain of the country, it resonated with me.
Yeah.
It became very personal, and I just fell in love with it. I'm like a Civil War fanatic. My vacations are visiting Civil War battlefields.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. What perspective are you looking at? Look, I don't know that it's easy to disentangle oneself from the excitement of war. I mean, it's phenomenal. Here, men bled and suffered and died. Pickett's charged there at Gettysburg, and you wonder, what were these people thinking walking into gunfire? Couldn't they have been tactically more smart
we could
than
discuss what it was like as a soldier walking in the battle.
Oh, have mercy.
And I have stories of what it was like on the battlefield.
So there's all of that. There's this great drama that connects with you almost on a visceral level.
Yes.
But then, as a man of God, you don't just look at this as the little boy walking with his daddy across the battlefield listening to stories. I'm assuming there's no way you can look at this as a preacher, minister of the gospel, as a theologian, without looking at the spiritual picture.
Oh,
here.
absolutely.
So you see the moving of God in here, and frankly, that's
how I
what most
interpret it.
historians don't see.
Mm-hmm. That's how I interpreted it. I was kind of looking at it through those fasting and God eventually answering all of those prayers.
Yes.
Because you look at those 2 latter days of fasting and prayer, not immediately, but over months, God answered those prayers dramatically. Let me tell you a quick story, if I have time.
Sure you do.
When I was visiting the battlefield of Malvern, which was the end of the 7 days battle.
And where is that battlefield?
That's right out of around Richmond.
Okay.
Richmond, Virginia area. The Malvern and it's one of those rare battlefields that is preserved perfectly. You know, houses aren't built. There's no highways through it, and it's preserved. It looks exactly like it did in the day it happened. And Lee sent his troops charging up this gentle slope, and they were just bombarded and massacred by the Union artillery. And one field officer who was on that at the top of the hill, he remembered when the next day, when the mist rose, the fog rose, he saw the field just scattered with bodies. And half of them were alive. They were wounded. And he said that they were moving. And he said it gave the entire field a crawling effect. It looked like the entire land was moving. And a horrible picture of suffering and war. And I was there, and I read that statement by that officer, and I positioned myself in about the same place where he was. And it was a serene summer day.
Yeah.
You know, perfectly peaceful, and I was in that position, surveying the field, imagining what it was like, imagining the cries of help and suffering. And it just struck me the horrors of war.
That's right.
The horror of sin and what it does to us, what it's doing to this planet. And I thought of the great cosmic battle between Christ and Satan that the Bible describes, and Christ's ultimate victory. And I just, and all those thoughts flooded my mind as I pondered that battlefield and the suffering and carnage of war. And that's really a microcosm of the suffering of the entire planet over the ages. And that's why we long for Christ to come and end all of this.
From God's perspective, now I'm going to ask you to put words into God's mouth. Don't worry, preachers have been doing that for a couple of thousand years. As God looked at the Civil War, how would he describe it? This Civil War, this 4 years of conflict, was what? And achieved or was to achieve what?
Ultimately, to purge this land of slavery. That was a high sin against God, as the abolitionists said. But I think God's perspective on it is best captured in Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln, at the end of the war, finally realized that the war was God's punishment for slavery on this nation. And God, I think He gave this long, drawn-out, horrible, bloody war as a punishment for the sin of slavery. And the sacrificial lamb was Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated after the victory. When the American people, the North, was so elated, and then to hear of Lincoln's assassination, that changed everything. That's how some historians, looking at it from a religious perspective, have said that Lincoln was like a lamb sacrificed.
Interesting
almost
way
like
to describe
Christ.
it. Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting way to
So I
describe
think
it.
God spoke through Lincoln. I wish we had time to walk through the second inaugural address. That eloquent, without question, as significant as Gettysburg Address was, the second inaugural address is Lincoln's finest speech, most profound speech, most theological speech. And he describes, with malice towards none. It's charity towards all. That's God speaking, I believe, through Lincoln's second inaugural address. That's what God thought about the wars, what Lincoln said in the second inaugural address.
Interesting, isn't it? 4 years of turmoil, or decades of turmoil, as a matter of fact. Slavery ultimately abolished. Its impact hung around and hung around and hung around as people didn't want to accept the will of God.
The two great contributions of the Civil War, the Revolution created the nation. The Civil War preserved a nation. It took years to reconstruct the Union, but it was a nation again. So it preserved the nation, or created a nation, really, and preserved the nation, and ended slavery as an institution. As we all know, we still struggle with racial issues to this day. But slavery as an institution, thank God, was eradicated in the 13th Amendment.
Amen. Dr. Lake, thanks so much for your time. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Pleasure.
You know what we tried to do? We tried to do a lot in a little. Maybe we'll need to carry this conversation on sometime.
Sorry, I got too much detail on some of the battles.
There's so much detail. How could you do anything else? Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy. And thank you for joining us. This has been truly a blessing. He's Dr. Judd Lake. I'm John Bradshaw, and this has been our conversation, brought to you by It Is Written.